Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror. I've got some fantastic horror magazines to talk about. So during May, we've been enjoying the Horror Mayhem reading event, which is focused around reading horror and particularly shorter works of horror. And one of the things I wanted to do as part of my reading for Horror Mayhem was read some horror magazines. So I've got a few here that I've been reading this month, and I've really enjoyed all of them. So very different from each other. Some of them short story magazines, some of them like non-fiction. But I've had a great time with all of them, and I thought I'd spend a little bit of time today talking to you about them. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about reading magazines, and I don't typically read magazines. Most of my reading is of novels, basically. I read short story collections occasionally, but probably 90% plus of my reading is novels. More recently, if you've watched the channel, you'll know I've been reading manga, which I've enjoyed. But I've really enjoyed the experience of reading magazines as well. And I think the reason is, when I read a novel, my natural instinct is to read it from beginning to end without interruption. So, there will be interruptions in terms of having to go to work and eat and things like that, but I won't read anything else for the duration of the time I'm reading a novel. One of the things that's really nice with magazines is that you don't necessarily feel, or I don't feel, that instinctive drive just to read them cover to cover. So I very much enjoyed with these just dipping into them. So I read all of them, but I didn't read all of them in one go. I was kind of flipping between them, and it was a very enjoyable experience. So let me talk to you quickly about all of them. And they come from 3 different stables. So all of these, disclaimer, have been sent to me by the publishers, and those publishers are, for 2 of them, they come from the Midnight Magazine stable. So Mr. Fright, who's the editor-in-chief at Midnight Magazine, sent me these 2, so Midnight Tales and Midnight Magazine. Then from Justin Marriott, who is best known for his magazine Paperback Fanatic, I had an issue of Paperback Fanatic, and then some issues of Pulp Horror magazine. And then from Dave Brzezinski, who is a fantastic commenter on the channel, as well as being a publisher. So Dave publishes and is one of the editors of Occult Detective magazine. As I say, all very different from each other, all very entertaining indeed. So let's start with the Occult Detective magazine, as that's the one I've got in my hand. So this is basically short stories, but there are some non-fiction pieces in here as well, but all themed around occult detectives. So occult detectives being people who investigate supernatural goings on. And when I think of occult detectives, I think of, kind of like weird tales type stories from the 20s and 30s. But what's wonderful about this is the variety of different stories you get within it. So authors from all over the world contributing, and some fantastic tales in here. I'm trying to find out. So there's a Nigerian story in here, which actually was one of my favourite in the collection, which had a kind of interesting kind of technological side to it, which you wouldn't necessarily expect from an occult detective story. But yeah, a load of different stories. I think there's probably 10 or 12 stories in here. And then 3 or 4 essays as well, and then some reviews of occult detective type books at the back too. So yeah, very entertaining. And as I say, it's the range and variety of different stories that you get in here that makes it such an enjoyable magazine. It's quite a narrow remit. It's quite a tight subgenre, if you see what I mean. But this book, or this magazine, manages to cover a really wide range, whilst always being true to its roots of being occult detective stories. So yeah, definitely recommended if you fancy that type of thing. This is issue 8, issue 0. So there's like a special preview issue, which you can download for free on their website if you fancy giving it a try. Moving on then to the Paperback Fanatic stuff. So this is all completely non-fiction, but really entertaining. So I had three things here. So we had the Paperback Fanatic issue 44, which has got some wonderful articles in here. So there's one about disaster novels, which I particularly enjoyed. There's one about Gil Cohen, who's an artist who was best known for doing covers for the Executioner books, which if you've seen the channel, you will know I'm a huge fan of the Executioner books. There's a great article about books that were written by people who were in prison, which is really interesting. A few I'd heard of, but a number of authors I hadn't as well. And then there's also one, entertainingly, about kind of viruses and things like that, both in kind of trashy spy novels like this one, The Baroness, but also in horror novels like The Fog. So yeah, really, really entertaining. The Pulp Horror collections were just as good. So this collective Pulp Horror has issues 1 to 3 of Pulp Horror magazine. So again, some reviews, including some reviews by Will Erickson, who was Grady Hendrix' collaborator on Paperbacks from Hell, so a very knowledgeable horror reviewer. But also some nice kind of articles about particular authors. So one about an author called Charles Birkin, who I'd not heard of before, but who sounds fantastic. There's a really good interview with Guy Smith. So Guy Smith, very well-known British horror author from the 70s and 80s in particular, best known for his Crabs series of books, which you can see some of the covers of there. So really interesting interview with him, and particularly interesting hearing his kind of reminiscences on the British kind of pulpy publishing industry in the 1970s, and how he made money writing for like adult magazines and things like that, as well as writing novels. So that was very interesting, and also another interview with an author I hadn't heard of, Michael Parry, who did a load of in particular was an editor on short story collections, and again hearing him talking about the mechanisms of putting a short story collection together was really, really interesting. So that was great. And then I also got from Justin issue 8 of Pulp Horror magazine, which has got great article about crocodile books, some of which again I've read, some of which I hadn't. Some stuff about EC Comics, and this section, which was fantastic, which is about this German kind of pulp magazine called a Grusel Krimi, which has got just some wonderful covers. So that was one of the things that is just wonderful about this as a magazine, is just perusing it and staring at all the fantastic illustrations and covers and things like that that are presented within it. So yeah, a real joy to read that. So moving on then to Midnight Tales and Midnight Magazine. So Midnight Tales I have talked about on the channel before. So a short story collection. I think they do 2 a year. I've read a couple of them now. So I've read this one, which was issue 6, and I've read issue 5 as well. Really entertaining, really nicely put together. So it's definitely got a kind of definite kind of indie underground kind of vibe to it, with these illustrations, and also even with the typeface they use. But yeah, just a really enjoyable collection of different short stories. Some of them like very gross indeed. Some of them quite humorous, some of them quite dark. There's a bit of kind of poetry type stuff in here as well. All sorts of stuff going on in here, but thoroughly recommended. Really, really enjoyed it. And then Midnight Magazine, and I need to do the thing where I cover up their slightly saucy cover. So this cover is fantastic and was done by, what's the guy's name? So the cover was painted by Emanuele Taglietti, who was an Italian, or is an Italian artist, who was particularly well known, I think, for doing the covers on fumetti in Italy. So fumetti just means comics in Italy, but over in the West and in horror circles, it's a term particularly used to describe these really kind of sleazy, over-the-top sex and violence type comics that were published in Italy in the 80s in particular, I think. And there's an interview with Taglietti in here, which was really good, and there's also an article about fumetti, which was really interesting. But the thing I love about Midnight Magazine is it just covers the whole range of horror stuff, but it's all like Pulp Horror, often talks about things you've kind of heard of but not read, and things you've never heard of. So it really digs into the kind of like the underbelly of horror, I guess. And surfaces, horror books that sound fantastic, but which are almost impossible to get hold of nowadays. You don't get the real mainstream stuff in here. Midnight Magazine is the same. So talks about, there's some stuff in here about like really, really low budget indie horror filmmaking. There's an interview with a like a really low budget movie director about a film he's making and like a set visit to that film, a film called Hellvan, which I did try and track down, but I haven't managed to find it. But that was one of the things I found reading Midnight Magazine, was I just kept on having to stop to like Google things and see if I could find trailers for these movies on YouTube and things like that. There's also a really lovely interview, which is really more of a discussion between two guys who worked together at a cinema in like the 80s or 90s, I think, like a kind of cinema that used to show like late night horror movies and that kind of thing, and then just reminiscing about the experience of working there, which was really interesting. It was an interview with a director called J.R. Bookwalter, who I've heard of, and I think I saw his movie The Dead Next Door like way back when in the 80s when it came out, and enjoyed that. And then you've also got like movie reviews, book reviews, things like that. So all sorts of great stuff in here. There's an article about Ghost Rider, the Marvel horror comic. There's even, so I said this covers all sorts of different horror type stuff. There's even an article about a horror themed breakfast cereal called Freakies, which I think was big in like either the 70s or 80s. I can't remember which one. So there's someone like writing very passionately about Freakies and the different cartoon characters that went along with the cereal and how much an impact they had on them as a kid. So just really wonderful stuff, and clearly written by people who really, really love the horror genre as much as I do. So yeah, a fantastic read. So I hope you enjoyed that. It really was a pleasure to read all of these magazines, and I'm blessed to have more issues of all of them to go through as well. So yeah, I do urge you to check them out. I will try and leave links in the description to places you can get them. Certainly Occult Detective magazine and like Pulp Horror and Paperback Fanatic are available on Amazon. Midnight Magazine and Midnight Tales I don't think are yet, but I'll leave a link to a site where you can get those. But yeah, thoroughly recommend all of them. Do let me know in the comments if you've got any other recommendations for kind of indie horror magazines. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're really good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.